All right, so the lesson for today is on rhetorical devices, which I will sometimes use the term rhetoric, subtitled The Art of Persuasion. So in one of the other lectures, I made the distinction that dates back to Aristotle between logos and pathos. And what we're going to be focusing on today is going to be more on the pathos side of that dichotomy. So here are some common linguistic tools or rhetorical devices that commonly impact our psychology in a way that resonates more with the affective or the emotional pathos side than it does with our reasoning or logic. All right, so here's the definition. Recall that equals df period is just a shorthand for is defined as, so I'll use that from time to time. Linguistic tools used to persuade. So it's language that has emotional or psychological or affective with an A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E. Usually you hear effective with an E, but it's affective, and that relates to emotions. So they have psychological and emotional or emotive force. So remember that music that was popular 10 years ago or so called emo? Well, this is the same, this is a word with a similar root. It all has to do with emotion. But in general, just think of rhetorical devices as language that is loaded or colorful. So just hearing the device has a psychological or an emotional impact, as we'll see as we go through several common examples of rhetorical devices. And they're not necessarily all bad. You know, sometimes they can be found in a presidential address. You know, think about the emotions that are invoked when you hear a recording of King's "I Have a Dream" speech, or if you read Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Right, emotions, they an emotional response is common, and it can lead to a lot of positive change. So these go both ways. You know, not to throw too many Star Wars metaphors or analogies at you, but you can think of this like the Force from Star Wars. You know, the Force is not necessarily good or bad, period. It just depends on how you use it, right? So same thing here. Skywalker and Yoda are kind of using these like King or Lincoln would, and as we'll see, maybe some advertisers or some evil dictator or totalitarian leader would use these as Vader or the Emperor would. Okay, enough of that. So I already mentioned King and other sorts of evil, but the dark side here goes along with some of these terms that some of them you might have heard before, exploitation probably, and pandering is one you might not be aware of. So when you pander to a person or to a group, you're really appealing to their base instincts and desires. So advertisements do this by appealing to our carnal desires for sexuality. So if you see a beer advertisement that just has a lot of sexually appealing women in that are scantily clad in bikinis and whatnot, that can be a form of pandering. And then sensationalization often happens with news reports and media. And that's really about taking a story that might be neutral, or it might be positive or negative, and then aggrandizing it, blowing it out of proportion. This is just funny because we just talked about the Star Wars thing, but in the recent news, and it might not be so recent when you hear this, but Obama got some criticism because he meant to say that he doesn't have he's not a he doesn't have magical powers. He can't control Congress, and so what he said is that I can't do a Jedi mind meld on them, and he meant to say Jedi mind trick. That scene where Obi-Wan kind of waves his hands, and then the stormtroopers or whatever, the guards, they let him pass, and so it was a flub, I guess, but really, really minor, and the press just really blew it out of proportion, and so that could be an example of sensationalizing. All right, so what we're going to do now is just go over really common rhetorical devices that some of them you will have heard of, some of them you know what they are, but you didn't know that they had this name. And then from now until, who knows when, you're going to start seeing these left and right in real life. And that's one of the cool things about this class, is that it really does apply to things outside the classroom. All right, the first one we're going to talk about are euphemisms. And so you might recognize that root word there, and you might be able to think of some other words that start with that root, euphoria is one. So that is, that prefix is related or is connected to pleasure or something pleasant. So really, when you use a euphemism, you're making something sound better than it originally did. So if you focus on the second bullet point there, it's really just a nicer or a more pleasant way of saying something. And going back to the first one, there's a substitution here of language that is more pleasant or agreeable, or it's just less offensive than a term or a sentence or language that is neutral, or maybe it is offensive or unpleasant. Someone once called euphemisms unpleasant truths wearing diplomatic cologne. So I think that captures pretty well what we have in mind here. And actually, Congress has a long history of naming their acts in a way that so they come out as euphemisms. I mean, think about the Patriot Act, right? There has been a lot of criticism of the Patriot Act, and history might judge it as a draconian measure that overstepped the role of government and invaded the privacy of many Americans, U.S. citizens. But on the face of it, it sounds good, right? If you're a congressperson, and if someone heard, "Oh my God, my congressperson voted against the Patriot Act. Wow, what a jerk they must be." President George W. Bush was responsible for signing the No Child Left Behind Act, and again, that certainly sounds good. And this was an act that was supposed to raise standards and help many children in terms of education. But again, it got a lot of criticism, and some people thought that it did more damage than good. But again, it sounds good. The Clean Air Act, why would you want to vote against that? Everybody wants clean air, right? But there are people on the left that criticize this act and said that, it sounds like it's environmentally friendly. It sounds like an act that liberals and some Democrats would advance and they would be in favor of, and maybe some Republicans too, but not necessarily. But a lot of liberals and Democrats voted against this because they thought that yes, it made it law. It forced higher standards, industry standards, but it didn't. Those standards were not enough, and some liberals thought that we could have done much more. Okay, here are some more examples from everyday life. Think about the term used car, right? Is there a euphemism for used car that you can think of? Think about the last time you, maybe some of you have bought a car recently from a dealer, and you might notice there's not a big sign that says used cars for sale. They don't, I mean, maybe at one point they did, but they don't do that anymore. Now, if you buy a used car, you're buying a pre-owned car, right? And sometimes they'll even add the term, certified pre-owned, because that sounds a lot better than, who wants a car that's used? Being used has these negative connotations. So euphemisms serve to rewrite the language so that those connotations either go away or that they're replaced with good ones. There's a lot of controversy about torture. It makes me think of that film Zero Dark 30 that got flack for its graphic depiction of torture, and also the interrogation methods that took place, over the last 10 years. Waterboarding, right, was a big controversial topic. Was it torture? Was it not? So here's a euphemism for torture: enhanced interrogation techniques. So the defenders of waterboarding might say, no, it wasn't torture. It was these enhanced interrogation techniques, which doesn't sound as bad. Gambling is actually rarely used by the gambling industry, and instead, some of you might know that they don't always call it gambling, they'll call it gaming, right? If you gamble, you can lose money. You can, lose it all. You could lose your life savings, but, games usually are just for fun, and in the end, it doesn't matter if you win or lose, so it sounds a lot better. Even at some bars, euphemisms are being thrown around. Instead of a bartender, a title for some of the people with that occupation are calling themselves molecular mixologists. So sorry, as I so that I guess isn't that so it's molecular mixologist, and I guess it's not here on the slides, so sorry about that. Okay, pornography. Someone that works in that industry might say, no, I'm not a porno star. I work in adult entertainment. Right? And again, that sounds better. If you have to tell mom and dad that you, would you rather tell them that you're in porno or that you are an adult entertainer? Well, those are both pretty bad, but I think one sounds better than the other. Defecate is a euphemism for all sorts of other terms that I won't go into here, but I heard here's another one that this actually could go either way, but this is a little gross, but dropping the kids off at the pool might be a euphemism for defecate. This is one of my favorite ones, missile. Right, a missile sounds violent and destructive, but if you think about it, you can get away with calling a missile a delivery system, right? It just delivers something really, really fast, and the thing it delivers just happens to be very, very explosive. Affair. If you have an affair on your spouse, that's really bad, but if you call it a rendezvous, that sounds much better. Herman Cain was in the news, in the recent past, and he described, he was one of the candidates for president in 2012, and there was gossip about whether or not he had an affair, and he described the relationship with the woman that he allegedly had the affair with, it was his friend. Yeah. Sorry, honey. I just hanging out with my friend. We're just friends. I want to call to your attention this this idea that this linguist Steven Pinker came up with, called the euphemism treadmill. And Pinker argued that there is a pattern with a lot of euphemisms that they once they acclimate to the society, or rather when the society acclimates to the euphemism, it sort of loses its positive connotation, and that over a certain amount of time it could at first, the first year that it starts to be used, it can be a pleasant sounding replacement, but then we get used to it and then it becomes neutral and then even negative again, and then it's replaced with another euphemism. So with this example here, it'll be if that probably wasn't too clear, but this example I think will clear things up. So a long time ago, handicapped individuals were referred to as lame. Today we use the word lame just to mean, when something's not good or bad. That video game is lame, that TV show is lame, Ryan's lecture today is lame, blah, blah, blah. But many years ago, it meant someone with a disability. And then that word was really taboo and offensive, and then the word crippled became popular. And that was actually the euphemism. Don't say lame, don't say that. Say crippled, which is so funny because crippled sounds so offensive. And in some of our lifetimes, handicapped became much more popular. Don't call someone crippled, that's offensive. Call them handicapped. And now, in the last decade or so, even handicapped has been replaced with disabled. And you can see why it's called a treadmill, right? Because the words just get more and more pleasant sounding, or at least less offensive in this case. Now disabled is being replaced sometimes with physically challenged. And one of the things I love, one of the reasons why I love doing this class is I get to incorporate things that we talk about, examples of things we talk about from my life. So this is something I really experienced. There was this Toys R Us that was, close to where I live, and I drive by it every once in a while, and I would think, oh man, when I was a kid, that place was amazing, and I loved going there. And I just thought about, man, how many years has it been since I've been in a Toys R Us? So eventually I walked in and looked around, and to my dismay, it really hadn't changed that much. They still had the pink Barbie doll aisle, and they still had a video game section. There was video games when I was a kid, just like a lot of you, So I mean, maybe maybe the sort of tech devices had expanded, but it actually wasn't that different. But I saw a big poster that's related to this euphemism treadmill, and I saw a term for disabled individuals that I'd never seen before, and it was on this ad with Eva Longoria, differently abled kids, right? So that is, at least to my knowledge, a new euphemism for disabled. And, there's no commentary here. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing or that, this is a symptom of being too politically correct or something, but it's just something to consider. Maybe it's for the best, because, we want to respect individuals, all different sorts, and even though I just said different sorts, and so that's where we can kind of see this word differently abled. All right, so that was the first rhetorical device. Let's look at another one that is closely related, called a dysphemism. And this is sort of euphemism in reverse. So instead of substituting language that carries a more positive connotation, we go in the other direction. We take language that is either positive or neutral, and we make it less tasteful, more offensive. And this can be intentional or unintentional. So loosely, it's an unpleasant or negative way of saying something. Funny story related to Dysphemisms. I had a student that won a $1,000 bet about Dysphemisms. She introduced the term in a conversation, and the person she was with just thought she made up this word and that it was not in the dictionary. And she had taken my course, and I taught her about Dysphemisms, and she said, "Nuh-uh, this is a word. I learned this from my philosophy professor." And her friend still did not believe and challenged her to check the dictionary and was so confident. I'm sure there was some alcohol involved. That's why, maybe, which led to a little overconfidence. And lo and behold, Dysphemism, check your dictionary. It should be there. And she won $1,000. I don't know if the person ever paid up, but I think she at least made him buy a lot of drinks, future drinks. So another reason that this class can be valuable and practical. Okay, so let's start with some examples of dysphemism. Rebel. What is a dysphemism for rebel? Feel free to pause and think about it. In this case, it will be terrorist, right? If you are, again, I swear I didn't plan this, but going back to Star Wars, the good guys with Skywalker and Han Solo, they were fighting for freedom and they were the rebels, but from another vantage point, from the Empire side, they were terrorists, disrupting the peace. Breast augmentation is sort of the medical term for that surgery, but a dysphemism for that could be boob job. Dead. We often use euphemisms for dead because it's such a sensitive topic, especially right after a death has occurred. So we'll say things like passed on, passed away, sorry for your loss, right? So here is a really terrible, and I apologize in advance, dysphemism for dead, worm food. But if you just Google euphemisms or ways of saying dead, I'm sure you'll get lots of hits. Pushing daisies. Have you ever thought why they say that? Well, that's because you're buried 6 feet under, and you're fertilizer for the flowers, and you're kind of causing the daisies to grow and be pushed up. If you there are lots of negative terms for promiscuous people, for promiscuous women, unfortunately, and so slut or prostitute or hoe, and the list goes on and on and on. Okay, we talked about definitions in another lecture, and whenever the language you use in a definition becomes too colorful, then we've got a rhetorical definition. So we looked at sort of regular definitions, philosophical, stipulative, definition by example, synonym, proper definitions, but we never went for definitions where the language was too colorful. Think about a rhetorical way to define abortion. Right? A neutral way might be the termination of a pregnancy, but if you are pro-life and very vehemently against abortion, you might define it as baby murder. Take the term war. Well, what if I define war this way? Let's start with sort of the neutral definition might be an armed conflict between two nations. A rhetorical definition of it might be something that the male leaders of the world do to make up for tiny genitalia. Premarital sex. The dictionary might say, intercourse before matrimony or something. Or we could define it as the unholy act of sinners and STD winners. Okay, moving along. The next device is called innuendos. So innuendos imply what they don't say. There's subtext to them. There's some undertone or message conveyed that's not explicitly there, but it's implied, right? So let's say, if you said, oh, Ryan came to class sober today, right? You're implying that I'm some kind of, unprofessional, alcoholic teacher that, drinks on the job. Makes me think of that movie Flight with Denzel Washington, which I saw recently. It was really, really good. But it was about an alcoholic pilot that would drink on the job, which would be worse than teaching drunk, because you're responsible for the lives of countless hundreds of people. So let's say that on one of your exams, so maybe someone asks me, hey Ryan, how did we do on the exam? And I say, well, some of you passed. Well, there's an implication there that some of you didn't. But logically speaking, when you say some people passed, it doesn't necessarily entail that some people didn't, right? Isn't it true that some people think of a class that that's not online. When you go to class, let's say that, or let's say we met, in a real classroom, and I said, isn't it true some of you have fingers, right? Isn't that true? Yeah, so it's true that some of you have fingers, and in fact all of you have fingers, right, presumably. So some does not imply, logically speaking, strictly speaking, it doesn't logically imply some are not, but loosely we use language like that to make such that implication. All right, here are some sexual innuendos. That is, that's maybe where the word innuendo is more familiar. These are, I apologize for these, they're a little crude. Do you want to ride on my sleigh tonight, little girl? All right, so the gross sexual connotation there. Be careful, he's a Homo sapiens thespian, right? So that sounds really sexual, but there's nothing sexual there. Homo sapien is just the term for humans. I think we're actually Homo sapiens sapiens or something. And then thespian, maybe it kind of sounds like lesbian or something, but a thespian is just, someone that works in the theater. An actor is a thespian. And I have an example here. If you have access to any episodes of The Office, there's an innuendo. This episode, season 6, episode 13, and it's about 5 minutes into the episode. So, but you don't need to know that for the class. But if you've got access, that's a good one. I think it's another Santa Claus one. Okay. Next rhetorical device is called loaded questions. So these, let's say they're innuendos, so they have implications, but they're in the form of a question. And the way these work is, start to think about questions in general, and you'll realize that, all of them, or at least most of them, they all carry with them assumptions, right? Even something as boring and trivial and innocuous as a question like, what time is it? Think about the assumptions there. What do you assume? Well, if you ask somebody what time it is, you assume that, they know what time it is. If they're, maybe you see they're wearing a watch, you're assuming that the watch works. What else do you assume? Well, you assume that they're going to be able to understand you. You assume that they speak English. You assume that they'll be able to hear you. Even deeper philosophical, you assume that there is such a thing as time. There's whole philosophy courses on time you could take. Some people, there's a famous paper from John Ellis McTaggart who argues that time is unreal, right? So you can go Google that and read that one. Hard to understand, but that's his hypothesis, is that it's just sort of an invention from human beings. Okay, so, it's not bad. We ask questions. It's not bad that we have these assumptions. That's just the way it works. But what makes it a loaded question is if these assumptions are not warranted, if they're not justified. Right, here's another Office quote. It's one of my favorite television programs. So Michael Scott's a character on the show, and he turns to one of his new workers and says, "Oh, you're very exotic looking. Was your dad a GI?" Right, so that's an offensive question. So the assumption there is that, she looks, quote, ethnic, unquote. And so it must be that her father, fell in love with some woman, during, Vietnam or something. And this worker was the result of their marriage or something. If you ask someone, how long has it been since you beat your wife? If you have no evidence that such a thing has occurred, that makes it a loaded question. Same thing here. Did you finally get rid of that stutter? Well, if you don't have any sort of history of a stutter, that's a loaded question. Stereotypes counts as a rhetorical device, and this is one that you've certainly heard of. So here's our definition. It is a claim about a group that's based on little or no evidence. So here are some stereotypes. People who wear glasses are smart. Right? There might not be lots of evidence to back that up, but yet a lot of people believe it. There are stereotypes about people in the South, that there's a lot of racism there. Gay men are effeminate, right? That is a common stereotype. People, you go over to the beach, Santa Cruz is full of hippies. Right? And some people say, well, if it's a stereotype, that must mean that there's some truth to them. And while it might be the case that some of these are true, the problem is that a lot of times we believe them even though we really don't have sufficient evidence. And certainly there are plenty of stereotypes that aren't true at all. And so if you say in general, well, there's got to be some truth to them, that just isn't the case. British people have bad teeth. White men can't dance. The list goes on and on and on. So that's a rhetorical device that most people already know about. But I just wanted to mention it because it's just so common, unfortunately, still in present day. There's too many stereotypes out there. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is a fancy word for exaggeration. So you probably know what exaggeration is, and hyperbole is, remember we talked about ways of defining words, so that's a definition by synonym. We say you never do so-and-so, you never tell the truth. Well, when you say that, that is probably an exaggeration. Or when somebody is a really big fan of something. I've seen Star Wars 1,000,000 times. You might think that because of all the references I've already made in this lecture, but if you did say that, of course that's not true. A million times, so if it's 2 hours, that'd be 2 million hours. Divide that by 24, and how many days is that? And divide that by 365. It's a lot of time. Here's a joke. I think this one is less funny than I want it to be, but I said rare, not raw. I've seen cows hurt worse than this. Get up and recover. So that's an exaggeration about, if you're served a steak or something and it's too pink, too rare. Another quote from The Office. It's not like booze ever killed anyone. Well, of course, that is exaggerating the number of people that, the terrible tragedy of people that have died from alcohol. Exaggerations went up 1,000,000% last year. I like that one. A lot of times whenever you say, over 100%, give 110% or I gave 200%, a lot that, I don't know if that ever really makes sense. At least a lot of times it doesn't. If the coach tells you put in 200% of your maximum effort, that doesn't make, you can't give more than 100% effort. That's just the way it is. Maybe you could give 200% of the effort you gave last game, if you only gave 33%, and maybe that's what they mean or something. But I think especially when you say 110, it's like go above and beyond your capability, and that just isn't possible. So this is a joke from from Letterman. President Obama yesterday had his annual physical. Apparently everything is all right. Earlier today, former Vice President Dick Cheney went in for his annual autopsy. right? So it's a joke about how old and how poor Cheney's health is. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one's a little bit more difficult. It's not bad, but it's less obvious than some of the other ones. It's called a Weaseler. And this is language or a word or phrase that weakens or waters down a claim. The upside of this one is that there are a lot of clue words that can give away that a Weaseler is present. Now, these aren't necessarily found with every Weaseler, but if you see them, then that is a good signpost that you might have a Weaseler on your hands. So words like perhaps, or maybe, possibly, almost, or the phrase or something, or sort of. Think about those old ads for toothpaste that you might remember. You know, they might say something like 3 out of 4 dentists recommend, brand X toothpaste. And if that's true, that's a very powerful statement, right? 75% of dentists recommend Crest. But a lot of times they'll throw in an extra Weaseler word to make the statement much weaker. Compare that with 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed recommend Crest. 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed recommend Crest. Well, without the word that one word makes a big difference. And that's a lesson here in logic. Is you would think, one measly word, how much of a difference can that make? It can make a big difference. Without that word, what that's saying is that 3 out of 4 dentists, in the world recommend Crest. That's a very powerful statistic. But if you say 3 out of 4 dentists surveyed, all of a sudden this statistic doesn't mean, we don't know what it means because we don't know how many people are surveyed. What if it's only 4 dentists, right? So 3 dentists in the world versus 75% of all dentists makes a big difference. And sometimes, advertisers or whomever will leave out that pertinent information. Think about the difference between I won the lottery and then adding the word almost. I almost won the lottery. Adding one word, huge difference, right? In one case, you're a multimillionaire. In the other, you're just, as you were yesterday. We add the word or the phrase or something to a lot of our language, and I'm guilty of it myself. I'd be curious if I listened to what I've said up until this point, if I've used that phrase. I bet you, or I very well may have. You're from Florida or something. It's kind of a filler phrase that we add in. But notice that that's true for everyone listening here. Isn't it true that you're from Florida or something? Most of us are from California, and so it's true we're from Florida or something, and being from California just falls under the category of or something, or something else, or some other state. This was written on a document that I was using to do some research. It was a PDF file I got from an internet database that I legally downloaded it, but they prefaced it with, this material may be protected by copyright law. So that phrase maybe is the Weaseler phrase that makes the entire sentence a Weaseler. Because without that phrase, it is protected. But then with it, it's like, well, it doesn't tell you very much. It may be, so what are the odds? Or how am I supposed to, maybe this one isn't. It doesn't, maybe it is, maybe it's not. So it makes it much weaker. Vagueness is related to Weaseler words. We saw in vagueness at the grocery store, up to half off. So that up to weakens the sale. If everything's half off, that's pretty powerful. But when you make it up to, we don't know how many items are half off. It doesn't say. This is a joke from a comedian named Dimitri Martin. He says that Weaseler words can make a big difference. Imagine if you have a kid and the doctor says, it's a boy. Sorta. Big difference. Okay. Downplayers. Downplayers are often confused with Weaselers. But instead of weakening or watering down a claim, downplayers are attempting to make something seem less significant. It's when you try to minimize something. It's sort of like hyperbole in reverse. You're exaggerating down. This too has clue words. Words like mere, merely, so-called, or putting things in quotation marks can sometimes indicate a downplayer. So let's look at some examples. A lot of people that are leery, or they don't want to accept evolution, even though it's been confirmed and is advanced by the majority of the scientific community, people will minimize it and say, oh, it's just a theory, it's a mere theory. And, maybe they're advocates of intelligent design and it conflicts their worldview, etc., and that's fine. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but in this case, calling something just a theory, it's the idea is that it's supposed to make evolution, not seem minimized or not as important a theory or not as widely accepted as we should think. But just as a side note, theory is ambiguous. We talked about ambiguity. Theory in science is actually a very powerful, well-confirmed hypothesis. You can't just throw around the term theory. Theory means that there is a large population of the scientific community that's on board with this. So a scientist would say, damn right it's a theory. But in every, loosely in sort of everyday life, we use theory, as something that is almost like an opinion. So I think that's what these people are trying to advance. So it's just a scratch. This is an example that you might hear. imagine you're a parent and you've got a teenager, and the teenager comes home, late, past curfew, and they borrow the car. They come home and say, like, Mom and Dad, don't freak out. I got in an accident, but it's just a scratch. So they're minimizing or downplaying the damage. Maybe in actuality, the fender got torn off or something, and they just want to really exaggerate in reverse the amount of the damage. Here's one with quotation marks. Jim got his, quote, degree, unquote, from University of Phoenix online. So you're calling into question the validity. You're downplaying the degree, just like someone might downplay evolution. Here's a Monty Python downplayer. Some of you might be familiar with this. Here is the this. Hopefully this still works, but here's the link to YouTube. This is a scene where it's Lancelot. I forget which knight it is, or prince. And he confronts the Black Knight, and they get into a sword fight. And the Monty Python guy, eventually starts severing the limbs, all four of them, in fact, from the Black Knight. And he he gets his arm cut off, and he's like, okay, the battle is mine. And then the Black Knight replies, "What? 'Tis only a flesh wound," downplaying the fact that his arm has been torn off by a sword. Okay, we're winding down here. Proof surrogate is another rhetorical device, and what's going on here is where you don't really offer any evidence. You just sort of state a conclusion matter-of-factly, almost like it's so obvious that you don't have to offer evidence. And it's like giving an argument without any premises. You're just giving the conclusion. The reason why it's called proof surrogate, the word surrogate is sort of a replacement or a substitution, and it's like you've given the conclusion, and instead of offering premises, the surrogate, the replacement of the premises, is your own confidence. And here are some clue words. You might say it's basic. Have any conclusion, preface it with "everyone knows" or "obviously," "of course," right? For example, obviously we should have never gone into Iraq. Well, that's really controversial. People say at the time we thought they were weapons of mass destruction, and there was this evil dictator guy that it was a humanitarian mission of sorts. But other people say, well, come on, it was a ploy. We were going there for oil. There were no WMDs, etc. But you need to talk about those reasons, and if you don't give them, then you've got proof surrogate. You could say, of course, people who believe in miracles are deluded. Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but at least give your argument, give your reasons, give your evidence, give your premises. Otherwise, you're just stating a conclusion that's unsupported. Everyone knows that you shouldn't awaken a sleepwalker. So sleepwalker got cut off there. A lot of people accept that, and you might think that it's just obvious, but to really know that that's true, we would need some confirmation from a peer-edited medical journal, right? Just getting anecdotal stories from people that we know probably isn't good enough. I'm sure stories where you awaken a sleepwalker and something crazy happens, those are going to circle fast, but are you really going to pass along the story where you woke up someone from sleepwalking and they woke up and that's it, and then they went back to bed? It's boring. Those aren't going to take off, and so the interesting stories get passed along, and we think it turns into a generality that people accept without thinking. Okay, and here's the final example. Here's proof surrogate again. I encountered this in real life. This is this is really from my Facebook news feed, and somebody posted this thing about God, and so I'll go through it really quickly, and then you'll see what the proof surrogate is actually what follows. It's in the comment. So here's some food for thought. Is God in reality more powerful than the idea of God? This was a topic of conversation in my philosophy of religion class today. It had plenty of people casting their thoughts about it. Some of them you had to laugh over. I'm curious as to what my friends think about it. Personally, I find God a complete enigma while simplistic at the same time. But does God exist because we have thought God into existence, God the idea? In other words, has God become a real, this concept that we kind of share in a lot of religions, is that what God is? Did we sort of fabricate God from my ideas, and now God sort of has a real existence that sprouted from that idea? Or does God exist because God is a reality, God really exists, and our thoughts of God, the idea, are more powerful than God themselves, if in fact God has real thoughts? So that was that's probably hard to follow. But look at this reply from Patrick Flynn. So I probably should have blacked out this person's name, but there's probably lots of Patrick Flynns in the world. So Patrick, if you're out there, I apologize. And it's not that he's doing anything wrong. This is just an example. So it looks like Patrick here is a believer, and instead of offering, an argument, here are some reasons for why I think God exists, so and so, you just got proof surrogate. Look what he says. God is real. End of thought. Right? He's just stating the conclusion like it's a matter of fact. There's no questioning it. I don't need to offer any evidence because it's just so obvious. That's a perfect example of proof surrogate. And that is it for our rhetorical devices. We will actually look at some more rhetorical devices that also count as fallacies next time.